The Business of Biotech is produced by Life Science Connect and its community of learning, solving, and sourcing resources for biopharma decision makers. If you're working on biologics process development and manufacturing challenges, you need to swing by bioprocessonline.com. If you're trying to stay ahead of the cell or gene therapy curve, visit cellandgene.com. When it's time to map out your clinical course, let clinicalleader.com help. And if optimizing outsourcing decisions is what you're after, check out outsourcepharma.com. We're Life Science Connect, and we're here to help.
Mission-driven venture capital has quickly become an innovative financial incubation arena for biotech startups in multiple indications, but perhaps none as bustling as cognitive disorders. More than 55 million people globally are afflicted with dementia, and that figure is expected to nearly double over the next 20 years and continue to at least double every 20 years thereafter. It's a huge unmet medical need, and the biotech industry is responding. Many projections for the dementia therapeutics market soar past $30 billion by 2030. Dementia-specific venture firms, with their deep understanding of the science and markets, are proving a key player in this landscape. I'm Matt Pillar. This is the Business of Biotech, and my guest on today's show is a venture veteran who, for the past several years, has been fully committed to the mission-driven venture model in a space that's ripe for biotech innovation. Dr. Jonathan Behr made his foray into venture philanthropy as the first managing director of the JDRF T1D Fund. Astute listeners might recall that Katie Elliott, the current managing director at the JDRF T1D Fund, was my guest on episode 80 of the podcast. But in 2019, John became a partner at the Dementia Discovery Fund, the world's largest family of specialized venture capital funds that invest exclusively in companies developing or enabling novel therapeutics for dementia. John's venture creation chops are solid. He was previously a principal at PureTech Ventures and vice president of new ventures for Enlight Biosciences. And he's co-founded and served on the boards of dozens of biotechs. But John's not just another VC in a nice jacket. With an MIT PhD and biological engineering to his credit, he's advantaged by a pretty comprehensive understanding of what's going on in the lab. And I'm thrilled for the opportunity to talk with him today. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to speak with you today.
The pleasure is all mine. And I want to get started with a little background on John. As I mentioned, you've got some pretty solid science chops. And I want to kind of start there before we get into the DDF story. You have a PhD in biological engineering from MIT. But if I look at your sort of career trajectory, research seems like it was sort of a brief stop on that trajectory. So I'm curious about the genesis of your interest in the business side of biotech.
Yeah, no, happy to explain. And I think once you add together undergrad and graduate research, the stop certainly didn't feel so brief. But I think my entree into venture capital was certainly serendipitous, but I think I was always interested in translation. So I had originally actually enrolled in undergrad as a physics major, realized nobody had discovered anything really new in decades, if not centuries, right, in physics, and that the cutting edge of science, a lot of it was biotechnology. And so got really excited about the field and the space and the opportunity to learn new things. Enrolled at MIT in the biological engineering PhD program because of the broader ecosystem that I would be exposed to, and the knowledge that MIT was an entrepreneurial institution. The faculty members I was working with were translationally minded, and there'd be an opportunity to have an impact beyond basic research. And so I was thinking about what my next steps would be, and I had the opportunity to consult to a venture firm, consult to PureTech on due diligence for various new projects while I was finishing my PhD, and really began to understand the opportunity that presented to have a portfolio of projects and potential investments and new companies that I could be involved in that would be both intellectually exciting because of the diversity, but also an opportunity to have a broader impact than if I had spent my career focused on one individual, more academic project. So it's really exciting to me from that perspective, and transitioned immediately when I, after I defended my thesis into a venture creation career.
What did you have to do from a learning standpoint at that point in your career to embrace the venture side of the business?
So it's certainly very different than just being a scientist, and I had the self-awareness to know that I was interested in other translational paths. And so while I was at MIT, I did coursework at the Sloan School of Business, and participated in activities outside the classroom that were business related. And I think when we're interviewing potential new hires, the first real questions we ask are around the person's vocabulary and commitment to translation. We want to know if somebody's running towards company creation, running towards venture capital, running towards translation, or whether they're running away from the bench. And so for me personally, having understood for some time that I was interested in other paths, and taking the time to learn the fundamentals, right, of corporate finance or entrepreneurship, or the business or law behind biotechnology, was really important, so that I had that foundation to learn more quickly once I got into the business side full time. And venture is, as I mentioned, I think it's a portfolio business, right? It's you need to learn quickly and gain knowledge in many different spaces, right? And you're never going to be the world's expert at any individual thing, but you need to be able to work with the world's experts in those spaces to not only identify the best investments, but then also to be a good board member and a good investor, and to be able to add value and help guide those companies to be successul.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, running toward venture or running away from the bench. And this is a total aside, but I'm curious about your perspective on. I've had numbers of conversations with former research experts who work their way into various aspects of the biotech business. If someone is seeking to run away from the bench, many of these conversations kind of start there, right? Like, I just couldn't see myself spending another week, month, year in the lab. What are some of the other alternatives that you might suggest to folks who, maybe aren't running towards venture, but feel the need to run away from the bench?
That's a really good question. And I think it is certainly career stage dependent, right? I think if you are very early career, I certainly think consulting is still a good opportunity to learn about biotechnology more broadly, the business of biotech and pharma. I think most people don't even understand what career opportunities are out there if they've come through an academic trajectory, right? Nobody's applying to college when they're 16, 17 saying, I want to be a venture capitalist, right? Unless you happen to have somebody in the family, you probably don't even know that job exists, right? I mean, you're just a few years past saying, I want to be a fireman. So, I think consulting is certainly an opportunity, but I think really practical experience broadly and just understanding what's out there is really important. I think many universities have very good biotechnology clubs, right? Or other sort of extracurricular venues where you can get exposure to what other jobs exist, whether it be, corporate strategy or business development or search and evaluation or venture capital or, public stock analyst analysis or management consulting, right? There's so many jobs that it's hard to understand unless you've had some practical exposure to them. So I think getting practical exposure is really helpful if you can do that, as an intern or through some other avenue.
Yeah. The other thing, excuse me, about your history so far that strikes me is just how willingly you've embraced so many different modalities and therapeutic areas. For instance, you worked on imaging and ultrasound technologies. You worked on small molecules, large molecules. I'll drop another name. Vedanta's Bernat Ollier has been a multiple-time guest on the show. You were a co-founder of Vedanta Biosciences that Bernat heads up. You mentioned earlier Lisa Deschamps at Aviato Biosciences. This is another one of your startups. What do you think, like at this stage in your career as a venture capitalist, what do you consider sort of the advantage of that breadth of experience that you've embraced, like I said, as opposed to being a specialist? Because I talk to plenty of people who are specialists too. They plug into a specific indication or a specific therapeutic area and stay there for a long, long time.
I think that's an excellent question. And in some ways, the questions boil down to what does it take to make a good investment, right? And I think I am a specialist, right? Just not in any of those specific categories that you mentioned, right? I'm not a specialist by modality or I have at times been a specialist in different therapeutic areas, right? Or different areas of science. And I think, most venture investors will rattle off very similar criteria of what they look for in a good company. One is certainly a management team that you can believe in and a solid development plan. And I think that takes repetition, right? And there's some pattern recognition. And it's not just the deals you do, it's the deals you see and that you don't do. And having the longevity in a role to see which of those succeed and fail and why. It's also working with other really great people in various roles that you can learn from. So I do think I benefited to a certain extent from having had the opportunity to move between various managers, right? And roles where I could learn from different people and learn different experiences. But at this point, certainly for SV and for the Dementia Discovery Fund, I do think that I have some specialization in early stage investing, right? Company creation, company building, seed stage investing, Series A investing, younger, smaller companies that still need to build capabilities, build data packages, and have very different problems or challenges, I should say, than companies that at later stages of development have specialty in several therapeutic areas, but more importantly, perhaps behind that, certain areas of biology, certain mechanisms, some of which overlap between type 1 diabetes and dementia, for example. But at the end of the day, I think reflecting on the podcast you did with Katie, or even the podcast you did with ADDF, I think many venture investors, right, what we look for is we're looking for problems to solve, right? We're looking for ways you can make impact because that's how you get rewarded. At DDF, we believe that the financial returns correlate with impact. So we're seeking to make impact first. And so I do think that being able to identify those types of problems and opportunities is also something that is an important skill when you're doing early stage investing.
Yeah. I mentioned that you got your start, I'm assuming. Was that your first foray into venture philanthropy from 2016 to 2019, I think, when you were at JDRF T1D Fund?
So it was my first foray into venture philanthropy, but I use that term more narrowly than perhaps you do. So for me, venture philanthropy implies a charitable purpose above other purposes. At JDRF and the T1D Fund are explicitly a not-for-profit. ADDF is a not-for-profit, and the models there are to recycle capital towards the mission.
Okay.
I think an important differentiator between that and the Dementia Discovery Fund is the Dementia Discovery Fund is actually a for-profit venture fund that's structured quite similarly to any other non-strategic venture fund. But the DDF was created for impact. And many of our limited partners are focused on impact. And so we have two sets of criteria that we need to satisfy. We need to satisfy our impact criteria, but then we also need to satisfy the financial return criteria. And we return capital back to our limited partners who can choose to reinvest in the DDF or reinvest in other mission-related activities, or they can choose to reinvest that capital elsewhere. So we are, so we don't call ourselves a venture philanthropy fund per se. So if you ask the question you asked me a little differently, was the JDRF T1D fund my first exposure to venture philanthropy? I'd say yes, but it wasn't my first exposure to strategic investing, right? Or impact-focused investing. So really, even going back to PureTech, you mentioned Enlight Biosciences is one of my experiences. Enlight was an affiliated investment vehicle created by PureTech, where all the limited partners were pharmaceutical companies. So Merck, Pfizer, Lilly, Johnson & Johnson, Abbott, AstraZeneca, I believe, were all limited partner equivalents at that time. And the mandate there was to invest in enabling technologies that could support drug discovery and development for any or all of those limited partners who wanted to enjoy the benefits of the technologies that were developed by that vehicle. So my entire career, I've been looking at more narrowly focused investment theses and mandates where you're trying to accomplish a goal and solve a specific problem or set of problems, as opposed to having the entire universe to focus on.
Yeah. Was it Enlight focused on a specific indication or a specific sort of grouping of indications, or was that more broad?
So Enlight was really focused on technology spaces. So enabling tools and technologies. So new discovery platforms, chemistry platforms, drug delivery platforms. So worked on a drug delivery company called Intrega, which was trying to deliver macromolecules and biologics orally, which is a really exciting company. Then I moved to Partners Healthcare Innovation, which is now Mass General Brigham Innovation. And there I was focused on neuroscience, on different clinical groups in the hospitals that were generating innovation in neuroscience and creating companies there and focusing on licensing and business development around higher value opportunities. So again, a constrained opportunity set where we were looking to maximize impact and benefit, and then move to the T1D fund and then SV in 2019.
Okay. So what was it that brought you to DDF?
I think first and foremost, always an interest in the problem. So I think many or most people have a personal connection to a dementia. And for the Dementia Discovery Fund, that means for us, any age-related neurodegenerative disease with cognitive symptom domains. So that includes Alzheimer's and PSP. That includes Lewy body dementia and Parkinson's disease. That includes frontotemporal dementia and ALS. It includes Huntington's disease dementia. So it is broader than Alzheimer's disease, although we do have a focus on Alzheimer's disease. So it started with an interest in that problem, and then a recognition that DDF was the first largest and leading fund family focused on dementia, and largest by capital committed. And as I've been interested in my entire career in impact and translation and making a difference, I didn't think there was another opportunity like it, just given the scale and scope and potential of DDF. And then finally, I was really excited to join SV as a management company. So SV is a management company with a 30-year history, to celebrate its 30th anniversary last summer. It's 5 fund families and a really excellent group of people to work with and learn from and tackle this problem. So many reasons to join DDF.
Yeah. I want to get a sense for how DDF has evolved in your time there. So can you sort of give us, paint a picture of what you walked into and maybe juxtapose that with the DDF of today? Not that I necessarily want to set you up to give yourself all sorts of credit for growth. I'm just curious about where sort of where we've been and where we are now. kind of story?
Well, I think that the DDF story is a great one because it's also a story that demonstrates a lot of progress and optimism. And so I'll start well before I joined and then contrast that with today. So DDF was originally conceived and then created all the way back in 2015. And it came out of a G8 meeting focused on the dementia health crisis. And this really is a global health crisis. It's been recognized as such by the WHO and by the CDC because of the demographic changes, the otherwise healthy aging population, and the fact that we don't have disease-modifying drugs. So you have this rapidly increasing number of people who suffer from dementias, and it's obviously a human tragedy, but also a huge burden on the healthcare system. And so there was actually a Harvard Business Review case study written on the formation of DDF, but fundamentally, this need was recognized. There was a belief that this was an area that was underinvested historically by not just venture capitalists, but also by pharmaceutical companies, and that all the capital that was in the system was being focused on a few narrow approaches to try to solve the Alzheimer's disease and other dementia problems. And so DDF was created as a fund, and a first amount of capital was committed by strategic limited partners before a manager was even selected to manage the fund. And then there was a solicitation process, and SV was chosen. So really, DDF started as an idea, a concept, a tool to solve a problem. SV then tripled the size of the fund. There was a final close in 2018, and then had to continue to build a bespoke investment team, continue to develop and refine the investment strategy, build a portfolio of companies that were exciting, and then begin to return capital to investors. And so that puts us where we are today, where we're investing out of our second fund. We've had successful exits. We have a team of incredible world-class investors, scientist investors, venture partners who bring experience from former heads of R&D or neuroscience R&D at major pharma companies to entrepreneurs and other experts. And we think we have the momentum and the foundation to continue to move forward and invest in companies that are developing transformational medicines for dementias and Alzheimer's disease and the other medical needs that I already referenced, while returning capital to our investors to continue to redeploy.
Yeah. Give me some color on how the refinement exercise has shaped the investment strategy at DDF. Like, I could ask specifics, but I'll start with the high level question. What are you looking for?
Well, our strategy is science first. So where we always start is looking for therapeutic hypotheses that we believe will be transformational if we can execute. So we need to believe in the hypothesis behind the target, the enabling data set, the ability to replicate the work, the ability to drug the target. And then, again, layering on the other criteria that all venture capitalists should be looking for, right? Which are more related to execution. Can you actually deliver the solution based on that science? But fundamentally, we're science first. We think that if we can develop a drug, it will have an investment return. I think in addition to the science, we're building on the expertise of a specialty fund. So the advantage of being focused is that we can build relationships, internal expertise, external expertise, knowledge bases that are specifically relevant so that we can not only find the best opportunities, but also actively manage them to give them the highest likelihood of success. So starting with the science, deploying this specific expertise that we can develop as a specialty fund. I think a third pillar of our strategy is precision medicine, and that's something that has been important across all of the SV managed life science funds, not just the dementia fund. So we need to be able to find the right patients and demonstrate the effects of drugs more quickly than waiting for symptomatic endpoints. And that's something that I think the field learned from other areas, but is even more important in CNS disorders, where historically many failures were based on the fact that the wrong patients were being treated, and you couldn't get an early read on efficacy. So I think precision medicine is certainly specifically important for investing in dementia. And then the last two aspects, I think, of our strategy that are important are company creation and early investment. That's important as an impact investor because it's the most direct evidence of additionality. If not for the SV team, the DDF team, these companies would not exist. These approaches would not exist. It also ensures that we have really quality deal flow and opportunities to deploy capital because we're creating them ourselves, and we have the proprietary economics and control that comes along with creating those companies ourselves. And then finally, diversification. So that word, I think, might be surprising if we're talking about a specialty fund, but we think it's even more important when you're talking about a specialty fund. So we intentionally think about how we can diversify across the portfolio, invest in multiple mechanisms, invest in multiple dementias, invest in multiple modalities, but also how we can have each company be internally diversified so that those companies don't sink or swim on a single event, or more importantly, on a single event that might be out of their control in the macroeconomic or macro scientific environment.
Yeah. I want to get back to the scientific foundation and get a sense for how DDF assesses the science behind the companies that it gets behind. I mean, as I mentioned, you've got some pretty good experience academically and in research there. But what does the actual mechanism look like when it comes time to assess a potential company's scientific foundation?
I think we have many tools in our toolbox to do that. So certainly the first is the full-time team. And the full-time investment team, as I mentioned, we're made up of scientist investors. So each of the partners focused on DDF and each of the non-partner investment team members have a PhD. So we can make a first triage of opportunities and select those that we think are worth investing more human resources to continue to evaluate. And beyond that, we have many other tools. So I mentioned the venture partners and advisors. So internal to DDF, we've signed a group of venture partners and advisors, scientific advisors, who we think represent not only world-class expertise, but a breadth of expertise. So I mentioned some of the criteria, some of the expertise, but for example, Tetsu Maruyama, who's a venture partner and for DDF was the former executive director of the ADDI, also former head of drug discovery at Takeda. We have Jim Summers, who is the former vice president and head of global neuroscience research at AbbVie. Right? We have Lynn Hughes, who is former VP and head of CNS growth strategy at IQVIA. Or Tim Harris, who is the former EVP and R&D at Biopharma or SVP of precision medicine at Biogen. And these are just some of the venture partners that we call on and who play a role in all of our deal teams and all of our company creation efforts. And then outside of or in the next sort of concentric circle of expertise that we can draw upon and the next stage in our process, we have the expertise we can draw upon from our various partners. And so those partners include our limited partners, and we have a standing scientific advisory board that includes representatives from many of our strategic limited partners, but also our non-limited partners, so our foundation partners. So we work very closely with many of the foundations in the space, whether they be research foundations or patient advocacy foundations, like the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, ADDF, or Parkinson's UK, or Michael J. Fox, for Alzheimer's Research UK, Target ALS, just to name a few.
Yeah. Company creation comes with I'm assuming it comes with a set of risks and challenges that perhaps investing in a clinical stage company that has some data to show for itself doesn't, right? What do you consider the most challenging and or risky aspect of company creation? Like, I don't want to answer for you, but the first thing that pops into my head is staffing, talent, right? Like, you've got a translatable idea, but maybe you don't have the infrastructure from a human resources perspective right off the bat to make that move. So that would be one. But you tell me, like, what is the riskiest or most challenging aspect of that model?
Well, the unsatisfying answer is it depends. But I think that in reality, there's multiple failure modes and you can't get any of them wrong. So
no pressure.
I think for to be controversial, I think certainly you'll hear venture capitalists at panels saying management is the most important and the most critical, because a good management team can pivot away from a failing technology or hypothesis to a new opportunity, right? And potentially be successful. And I think there's validity to that. I also think what you said is you can't succeed without good talent, whether that be academic founders, entrepreneurs, or people you bring to the table. And part of our company creation model, our venture partners, every company that we've created or built as part of DDF has had a venture partner, a DDF venture partner affiliated with that company creation or build effort, either as a founder or as an initial member of the management team. So we do bring expertise to bear when we're doing a company build. So I do agree with that. But you do need to have, again, especially for a science first fund, you do need to have a solid scientific hypothesis to build upon. And that could turn out, again, to fail later, and you might be able to pivot, but we're not going to launch a company, unless we can find both. We do have our own processes for building companies. We do, for example, have meetings that SV calls prepared minds meetings, which are analogous to scientific advisory board meetings before you've even started the company, where we bring in potential founders, potential co-founders, advisors, and brainstorm around key opportunities and issues in advance, often, of creating a company. So sometimes the people can come first, but I think all of these challenges are important, and I wouldn't say one is harder than the others. Yeah.
You mentioned precision medicine a little bit earlier, and that being a focus of SV. Do you hold any other sort of modality biases or favorites in terms of modalities? This is a space where we've seen. We'll get into this here in a minute. We've seen a little bit of tumult, for lack of a better word, in terms of approvals, even. So, yeah. Given the way that's shaping up, has DDF sort of ascribed to any specific modalities or mechanisms?
We want diversification. We also want to choose the right tool to solve the right problem. So we're very open-minded and have invested in many different modalities. So within our portfolio, we have small molecules, we have antibodies, we have antisense oligonucleotides, we have a gene therapy company. We don't yet have a cell therapy company within the DDF portfolio. There certainly have been cell therapy companies within the broader SV Biotech portfolio. At the same time, I think patients have preferences, right? And certain indications and certain unmet medical needs have best fits. So in many or most cases, patients would prefer to take a tablet than an injection, right? And, the industry would prefer a scalable small molecule manufacturing to a cell therapy manufacturing. So I do think that there's certain types of modalities that are an easier sell, but at the same time, where we're starting with is the unmet need, the right solution, and then the right tool to enable that solution.
Yeah. Okay, so you've got, a promising prospect with good science and maybe a good scientific founder who's willing to move the needle, and you decide to invest. You decide to go into creation mode. What does that look like in practice? Like, are there guardrails around what's provided and when and how? Give us a sense for how the actual investment vehicle works.
So you mean what's provided in terms of capital or resources? Maybe you could refine the question.
Well, I was thinking capital when I asked the question, but if there's more to the story, I mean, fill in the blank.
Yeah. So when we think about company creation, there's multiple stages, right? So there is a discovery stage where we try to, again, identify that problem and solution mix. There's the investment stage, right, where we build the thesis and we bring in the management team and we put in the capital. And then there's that building and growth stage where we're actively managing these investments, we're syndicating them, bringing in additional capital, helping the company hit important value inflection points, and then eventually the exit. And so certainly I think what we're looking for early on is not necessarily to fit a company into some set of cookie cutter criteria, but what we're looking for is an opportunity to create value quickly. As you mentioned, certainly company creation is riskier than investing in later stage opportunities. Certainly takes a lot more time and effort than evaluating an existing company for a potential investment. And so we need to ensure that additional risk and effort is balanced by the reward on both the impact side as well as the investment side. So we need that opportunity to say, we can build value. Here are some explicit milestones, some whether they be technology development, R&D, drug R&D milestones, but here's some specific milestones that we can hit with our initial investment and efforts that are going to validate the investment thesis, attract that additional capital, and attract that additional capital at a valuation that reflects the contributions of that founding team and the founding capital.
Do you typically commonly find the company in hunt mode, or are you sifting through RFPs on a daily basis and picking and choosing? Like, what's sort of the acquisition approach?
I think we have multiple sources of new deals. And I think when I'm talking to entrepreneurs or executives at early stage companies, certainly we get unsolicited inbound opportunities. We don't put out calls for proposal, right? But we do get unsolicited opportunities. At the other end of the spectrum, you use the word hunt. I mean, there's company creation efforts that we undertake because we've recognized an opportunity or need, right? And I mentioned those prepared minds as a mechanism, but we'll do landscaping analyses where we say, here's an area of emerging science that we see overlapping with commercial white space, an unmet medical need, and let's expend our energies to try to see if there's something here and a solution to create. So we have those two ends of the spectrum. And then everything in between, right? From the sort of referred opportunities, right, that come from trusted partners, to companies that are in the process of being built, right, already by an entrepreneur that we're introduced to, or maybe we've already known, where we can add additional value. And so we're willing to lean in and share risk and invest early or invest alone, and put in that sweat equity ourselves as well. For those opportunities that we think are really exciting, and again, that could be transformational. And I don't use that word lightly.
Good. The white space is broad right now. There's a lot of white space, right, in this span. The cognitive disorders are, as we ascertained, a giant unmet medical need, and even where we've seen approvals, we've seen lackluster results, lackluster embrace. Like I said, it's been sort of a roller coaster ride in recent years. So I'm curious about how sort of that roller coaster ride affects day to day at DDF? How is that, recent approvals, failures, public and patient perceptions? How do those inform what DDF is doing and where it goes next?
So I think that these sort of macro events are critical when you're looking at the medium to long-term trajectory of the field. So when DDF was first created in 2015, there hadn't ever been a disease-modifying drug approved for Alzheimer's disease. Even the symptomatic drugs that were in use were really, for all intents and purposes, decades old. We did an internal analysis and found that if you're only looking at oncology drugs since the year 2000, there were well over 500 new oncology drugs approved by the FDA. At the same time, there had only ever been 9 Alzheimer's drugs approved. And the first 2 disease-modifying drugs were just approved in the last several years. So you had this landscape where there was pessimism, perhaps, by many about the ability to successfully develop drugs for Alzheimer's disease or other dementias. And then you have these transformational events like the first approval of anti-amyloid drugs and Alzheimer's disease-modifying drugs. Or you ask questions about modalities, the first approval of antisense oligonucleotide drugs in the CNS, right, for SMA, or the first gene therapies for CNS diseases, which give either the pharmaceutical companies or the investors or other players in the ecosystem confidence that we understand these diseases well enough to deliver drugs. We understand clinical development well enough to develop drugs, and that the regulatory agencies have established pathways to get these drugs approved, and sometimes more lenient pathways than were expected, as was in the case with the anti-amyloid drugs or some of the ALS approvals. So we certainly can react to that. At the same time, venture is a long life cycle business. Biotechnology companies are long life cycle businesses. It takes many years to develop a drug. So we need to balance these individual events, which might be catalytic for investment interest, the ability to raise follow-on financing, public market interests, the ability to take a company public or not, and access that capital. We need to balance these macro factors with these longer term considerations like, what are the patient needs? What other drugs are in the pipeline, even if they're not in late stage clinical trials or approved. So we can ensure that we're creating a longitudinal plan for each of these companies, each of these investments that we believe can be individually successful. And we think there's a lot of room, again, because of the white space we talked about for many of these, for many companies to be successful. And from an impact perspective, we wish every company is going to be successful, not just the ones that we're investing in as well.
Yeah. You contrasted this CNS disorder space with oncology, and you referenced, that's the slew of approvals in oncology versus the very few in CNS disorders. And it occurs to me that where there have been 500 approvals, it's not hard to extrapolate from that data some regulatory strategy, because those regulatory pathways, you could assume that there are some well-established trends, right? You mentioned that there's been progress in the regulatory pathway aspect of CNS disorder. Color that in a little bit. Like where do you see that sort of pathway revealing itself, and how might that play into not just DDF strategy, but any CNS disorder company's regulatory strategy?
Yeah, so I'll take those two questions separately. So, I think the generic assumption, the generic approval pathway at the FDA had always been two successful phase 3 studies, right? you had to twice prove in a clinical outcome focused study that you could have a meaningful benefit with the appropriate safety profile.
Mm-hmm.
And where we have specific examples in dementias where drugs have gotten approved with very different data packages than that historical norm, right? Starting, or I can start the example certainly with aducanumab, which was the first anti-amyloid drug that was approved. That was really one successful phase 3, and then a second pivotal study that was more questionable, right? Both in terms of how it was concluded and what the resulting data package was, or going to the Amylyx drug that was recently withdrawn, right? Where it was an accelerated approval based on a single study. And so these examples were showing that, at least in the United States, the FDA was recognizing the unmet medical need, the burden on patients, and was willing to consider alternative data packages, right, when they were balancing the patient benefit and the potential risks. And I think that has been very encouraging for the field, because the time and cost to get a drug to the market that works is going to be substantially less than it would have been if you were assuming the original regulatory framework. Now, the FDA is continually updating their guidances. We can't be sure exactly what the path is going to be in the future, and it's certainly going to be drug dependent, mechanism dependent, disease dependent. But these were individually very encouraging events, I think, for companies and investors in the space.
Yeah.
And we hope that many of our companies will get to take advantage of accelerated pathways, either in the US or abroad, to get drugs to patients quicker and accelerate that impact.
Very good. What else sort of informs or influences DDF's strategy that our listeners who might be interested in, we've got plenty of folks who are coming out of academia with great ideas. What should they know about what influences DDF's strategy?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think we're trying to find the best opportunities to impact disease. And so I think if you're talking about academic scientists who are transitioning, certainly I think we're looking, I personally always ask the question, why now? And that sometimes translates to the academics as to, what's the fundamental new data point, understanding, insight, right, that suggests that this new drug target or this new approach is going to be the approach to solve this problem that's been facing us for so long. And to start, a new company or to make an investment in something at a very early stage, I've used that word transformational so much, I'm probably wearing it out, but the approach fundamentally needs to be differentiated in some way from what came before it, right? So we have a company called Curalis, which is focused on ALS. It's developing a small molecule, but also antisense oligonucleotides, and fundamentally is focused on loss of function of TDP-43. And they were able to develop some fundamental insights around ALS biology by using human-induced pluripotent stem cells. And the insight came from the unsurprising realization that biology was fundamentally different in human cells than in rodent cells, right? Or in all these preclinical models that had been used historically to study ALS. And we could point at experiments and data and say, this is the reason why this drug target was missed and why we should believe in it now and advance a new drug. And so I think having stories like that, which relates these new approaches to human biology and relates new approaches to fundamental new insights, right, is really helpful in establishing a case for why now. Sometimes it's not biology, sometimes it's a new tool, right? CRISPR gene editing is invented, and all of a sudden there's biology that couldn't have been accessed in a translational way before that you could now access. Or again, maybe we go back to the example I used previously. First antisense oligonucleotide is approved, and now there's new drug targets that you can get at in a lower risk way that you couldn't have before. So the insight is not always, or the reason the time is now is not always some new biology, but we really need to understand what's creating this novelty and this opportunity to make a new investment.
Yeah. Looking ahead at the landscape, looking at what's in front of DDF, not just DDF, but the entire CNS disorder space. What are you maybe most excited about that you can share publicly?
Well, that's a good question. I think we have many companies in our portfolio that we're excited about, and I think we can talk about certain themes, right? Certainly, I think that there is a lot of new biology that we're understanding with neurodegenerative diseases that's enabling us to go after new targets. And they might fit under some broader classifications that people have talked about in the past, like neuroinflammation. But the individual approaches are distinct from some of the more canonical targets that have been in the drug development landscape for decades. And so we have a company, for example, called Arini Biosciences that is entering the clinic with a new antibody to block neuroinflammation. But they're not targeting a cell surface protein or a cytokine. What they're targeting is a cryptic epitope of fibrin that is driving inflammation. So when there's blood-brain barrier disruption, in these neurodegenerative diseases, leaky blood vessels, fibrin escapes from the blood vessels, deposits in the extracellular matrix, and a very specific epitope is then displayed, which drives inflammation because the body's recognizing that there's some pathology. And so by blocking that with an antibody, we can have therapeutic effects in multiple disease models in neuroinflammation as well as in eye disease. So it's a new way to get at a mechanism that we know is important. But this is an approach that hasn't been tried before. We have another company called Nitrase Therapeutics that discovered an entirely new class of enzymes. So they discovered a class of enzymes that they call nitrases, which are analogous to kinases, but instead of attaching a phosphate group to proteins, they site-specifically attach a nitrate group. This is an entire white space area of biology that had never been studied before. This modification had been discovered in the past, but it was thought to be just driven by oxidative stress at random. So nitrase now is a development candidate, and it's advancing into the clinic to treat Parkinson's disease. But there's a potential for an entire pipeline behind it, not just in neurodegenerative disease, but in other diseases as the biology behind these nitrase enzymes is further understood. So I think there's a lot of transformational opportunities. I mean, I could spend another hour just going through our entire portfolio because we're excited about each opportunity. But I think going beyond that, just to reflect on something that was mentioned in your ADDF podcast, I think we're also interested in continuing to look at the drivers of disease and how they relate to age. So certainly the largest non-genetic risk factor, right, or the largest risk factor for sporadic Alzheimer's disease, for example, is age. Yeah. So, we need to continue to understand various mechanisms, whether it be mitochondrial biology, metabolism, or inflammation, or other age-related mechanisms that we can continue to target because they're not just usually relevant for one disease, they're relevant for many diseases. And that increases the opportunity for impact as well.
Yeah, very good. Well, you mentioned that you could talk for another hour, and it occurred to me a few minutes ago that I was going to ask you for access to some of the founders of your portfolio companies to be guests on the Business of Biotech. We can continue the conversation that way, perhaps.
Of course.
Yeah. We'll talk about that offline. Maybe come up with a roster of DDF portfolio companies that might be interested in coming on the show and sharing their stories. But I really appreciate the time you spent with us now. And if you need another hour, we'll do a part 2. How about that?
Yeah. Well, if your audience is interested, I'm always happy to share more about what we're doing. Because again, I think the unmet need is unparalleled. That creates the opportunity for impact and returns. And we certainly believe that a venture model is the right model to accomplish both. So maybe the part 2 is in a few years, we'll talk about a few more drug approvals. That would be very exciting.
Yeah, it certainly would. When there are those approvals, you'll be the first guy I call for perspective. So we'll definitely get a part 2 on the books.
Great.
Jonathan, thanks for joining me. Super insightful conversation. You've been a terrific guest, and I do look forward to having you back.
Thank you.
So that's the Dementia Discovery Fund's Dr. Jonathan Behr. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Life Science Connect, available to hear anywhere you listen to podcasts, and available to watch at our brand new video page at bioprocessonline.com under the Listen and Watch tab. Please do subscribe to our newsletter at bioprocessonline.com/BOB. In the meantime, thanks for listening.